Welcome back, everybody. So this is the fourth lecture on the topic of social class in the United States. And I'm going to pick up talking about social mobility. So let me get my bearings, as today is a different day than the previous lecture. The last lecture we were talking about, maybe it is for you too, I don't know. In the last video lecture, I was talking specifically about some of the consequences of social class. So this is what sociologists like to say, the so what, like why does social class matter? Social class actually matters in probably more aspects of our life that our culture acknowledges. At least, commonly acknowledges, but basically it affects everything. Your access to healthcare, mental health, physical health, their patterns of how you organize your family life, your access to education. I like to say that it's not the quality, it's not the, I think probably should actually have a difference here, that it's not the quality of instruction. It's not, it's the style of instruction is different, and the status that comes with your credentials, religion expression, religious membership, politics is very stratified, and then the access to the criminal justice system and the way the criminal justice system treats you. In a previous, or maybe that was a different, in a previous chapter, there was reference to the death penalty, and I think I said in that lecture that there are no poor people on death row. Death row is a punishment of poor people. Okay, so this slide is about social mobility, and your textbook suggests that there are three kinds of social mobility. If we were together in class, I would be talking about, I did this little exercise on the board that illustrates what this cartoon illustrates, and that is we are comfortable, or it is a common it's an acceptable idea that wealthy people pass on their wealth. But if this is true, then it would also be true that poor people also pass on their poverty. The same way that wealthy people pass on their connections and that literally their resources, poor people pass on their lack of connections, so lack of understanding about the way the market works, their limited, I don't want to say that necessarily they're limited job skills, but that's what sociologists refer to as social capital. What is true about our class system is there is less social mobility than is popularly assumed. We live in a culture that is taught and that we're socialized, that if you work hard enough, you're going to get ahead. We'll talk more about that. That's called the Horatio Algra myth. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so these three types of social mobility that your textbook talks about. You talk about what's called intergenerational, and that's what the cartoon is about. That's the idea that you will do better than your parents, and your parents did better than their grandparents. I think I said that in a previous lecture. That is no longer the case. For Americans, that actually people entering the labor force, family forming now, in order for them to maintain their relative social location, their relative rank in that economic hierarchy, will have to have more education and will work harder. They'll work more hours than their parents did. And so what used to be fairly acceptable American dream experience, that you would see an improvement, a relative quality of life improvement, is no longer the case. And I recently heard a statistic about how young people today, when they're graduating from college, are carrying more debt than their parents carried when they bought their first house. Structural mobility. Structural mobility is a really important idea, and it's kind of critical that you understand what we mean. And I've been trying to talk about that from the very beginning, but what is meant by the social structure. The social structure refers to, again, the distribution of jobs. Structural mobility is the idea that not the individual changes their relative rank. Remember, because we're really not about individuals, but that the structure changes. So say, for instance, your parents were, I'll just use my parents. My parents were school teachers and I'm school teachers. School teachers, we're working class. We're not, maybe you're middle class if you're like got all kinds of degrees, but for the most part, we fall under that sort of category of working class. Structural mobility would be as if all of a sudden or within a generation, the wages of teachers tripled. And then teachers would go from being this working class, occupation to maybe an upper middle class occupation. The same thing happens when jobs that once used to pay really good, say factory jobs, right? We used to have steel mills and auto manufacturers, and these were good jobs. These were jobs that provided wages where you could buy a house and you could save for retirement and you could pass on something to your children. Well, those jobs are just gone, right? They're not in the structure at all, right? Those jobs have gone away. And so that's an example of structural mobility, where the work that people used to do is a great documentary I used to show. It's a little outdated now, about Walmart and how these factories that used to make televisions for Walmart, now those factories closed. So the people moved, they felt the structure changed, and they went from having this middle class lifestyle, and they plummeted to the bottom, right? COVID is an example of structural mobility. And the thing about structure, it can go both ways, but what usually happens is it goes down, right? So COVID is a really good example. And the documentary or the Frontline that I've asked you to watch for this chapter is an example of how those families fell. Not because they woke up one day and they were lazy, right? But because their job went away and nothing they did, right? Another kind of social mobility is what's called exchange mobility. We hardly ever hear about exchange mobility. And this is what politicians or some economists like to say. They'll say things like, well, yeah, some jobs went away, but other jobs came, right? So it's that economic idea that the social structure changed. Exchange mobility assumes that people up here fell, but these jobs went up. And like I said, I can't really even think of before and after COVID. So my example there is how low wage workers or restaurant workers suddenly lost their jobs. So they fell into poverty, they fell into homelessness. But at the same time, you have the very wealthy, or you have tech people who suddenly are in higher demand, and now they're making more money. I actually don't know if that's true about the statistic, but that would be an example if that were true. Okay. One thing that I like to talk about that's always been interesting to me is the idea of what's called the rising above your raisins. The emotion, and there has been a lot of attention to this, but it's the idea that that social mobility comes at a personal and an emotional cost. If you think about social class, and I'm going to turn this off for a second. If you think about social class as a subculture, right? And that all aspects of our life are influenced by our social class, our religion, the people we know, where we live, what we dress, how we dress, what we drive, all of those are all parts of your culture, where you eat, where you vacation. If you radically shift in your social location, if you're born poor into a poor household, and by whatever turn of events, which isn't that common, you move up, you're shifting cultures, and there can be a lot of emotional pain, misunderstanding of your people. You go back to your home, people don't know what to talk about. So I'll just use myself, and it's not a very good example, but my dad grew up in a very poor community. He was the first person in his family to go to college. And when we would go visit, people wouldn't know what to say. They couldn't talk to him. They thought he was so much smarter than they were. Not exactly the same thing, but that's what this box refers to, is the rising above your raisins, right? And there's two really popular books, if you like to read things like this, that's effectively what they're about. One is called Hillbilly Elegy, and it's about a gentleman who grew up in Ohio and how he struggles and his people don't understand him and how he doesn't understand where he's going. And another one is called Heartland, and that's actually written by a woman who grew up in rural Western Kansas. I can't say that they're, the best written books, but they certainly, and they're memoirs, but they're worth reading. I think Hillbilly Elegy is actually a movie. And don't forget, you have a movie assignment to watch for this class. That might be one worth talking about. And one example that you could use in that book would be social mobility. And that's actually an example of intra, which isn't on the list, social mobility. So he's born poor, and I forget what his occupation is. He goes into the Marines and he gets some high paying occupation. And so he rises radically, social mobility. Okay, I have gone over my 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop this video right here.